So today we will be discussing on how business can collect, analyze, operationalize customer feedback to drive better product and better experience and ultimately better growth. Today's guest is Mike Appleton, founder of Core Consultancy. Welcome, Mike, to the webinar. Mike is an expert in helping organizations establish powerful customer insight program. His professional background is rooted in retail sector, including various operational roles across FMCG and general merchandise during his time with the John Lewis Partnership, the UK's largest employee-owned business, where he was also responsible for setting up their voice customer program. Mike, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rahul. Great to be here. Voice of customer is my topic of choice, so keen to get into the conversation and see where the questions take us today. So thanks for having me.
Perfect. So, Mike, the subject which you choose was voice of customer. That's interesting, customer. So, just giving a background to everyone, like voice of customer is more about like not only getting the feedback from the customer, but understand their persona, understand their pain point or something when they do deal with the company. So I have a question for you, Mike. How do you define voice of customer program and why it's important?
Thanks, Rahul. So I think if you were to ask 10 different companies to define what a voice of customer program means to them, you'd probably get 10 different responses. And usually that response is something that's pretty dated. So it's, you know, the view is that it's a case of we send out a net promoter score survey after an interaction, or we ask somebody, you know, to score us on a scale of 1 to 5 on how well they thought the interaction went with us. My philosophy and the philosophy of Core Consultancy is that we see it as much more than just a piece of data or a piece of software or a score. And for us, it's fundamentally a cultural mindset that the organization needs to adopt. So real voice of customer is ultimately the ongoing habit of capturing customer data, understanding that customer data, and actually acting upon it. And acting upon everything that your customers, the people that serve them, are actually telling you. I think a proper voice of customer program takes all of that customer noise and turns it into a real clear strategic advantage for the organization. But it only works if you combine the right mechanisms together. So you absolutely need structured feedback data points such as surveys, but you also need to capture the messy, unstructured conversations that customers are having with you and your organization and your employees as well. And crucially, and I'm a big believer of this, you need to listen to your frontline teams. When you blend that data with the reality of what your teams see every day when they're interacting with your customers, that's when you get a really critical functioning voice of customer program. And it moves your business away from constantly putting out fires and fixing problems for your customers to actually being able to prevent them from happening in the first instance. And you ensure that, you know, you look after that customer, and that ability and the mindset to look after customers is hardwired right through the company's DNA, from, you know, the board right down to the frontline employees.
Got it. Yeah, you are right. Like, so it is more about going in a deeper to understand the pain point of the customer. Next question for you is like, what are some of the most common mistakes company make when trying to implement VoC program?
I think there's quite a lot. So I write about this a fair bit in a weekly newsletter that we've got called the Core Perspective, and companies spend an absolute fortune on customer experience. But in terms of the points where they trip over, so they trip over at pretty much the exact same hurdles, because they treat listening to customers as a project rather than a culture. And the first big mistake I see is them being overly reliant upon surveys. So too many organizations spam their customers with surveys, and survey fatigue is a real thing, and it's at an all-time high. Businesses then fall into the trap of looking at, a tiny proportion of customers that actually respond to a survey. There's quite a lot of customers that will receive a survey and not actually respond to it, but actually have interesting insight. If you just utilize the individuals that are replying to your surveys as your majority, that's a really blinkered view to have. I think, speaking of ignoring kind of what's right in front of you, a massive blind spot that is failing to listen to your own people. So I touched upon this a little bit earlier in terms of the cultural piece, but employees that are working on your front lines, speaking to your customers, they are a huge untapped potential opportunity of data. And what we see is, they hear the recurring headaches and frustrations that your customers are facing on a day-to-day basis, and they'll be able to tell you what those problems are far quicker than a survey would. Yet most businesses don't necessarily have a structured way of being able to capture that knowledge from their employees. So your frontline teams are a huge strategic advantage that in many instances is untapped. So if you aren't giving them a platform to highlight those customer frustrations and suggest ideas on how they can be fixed, you're really only seeing kind of half of the picture. And the final point I would say here is that the final problem that I see, or mistake organizations make when trying to set up voice of customer programs, is they believe it's the right thing to do. So they measure customer satisfaction or net promoter scores for the sake of measuring it. And actually, if you don't do anything off the back of capturing that insight and the data, then ultimately you've just got a very expensive research program. And what we need to be in a position of is, you have a voice of customer program, of course, to be able to monitor kind of metrics, but it's the insight and the data that you capture from that you then put into action. And I'm sure we'll get into some of this in the next couple of questions, but it's actionable insight that means a change for a process that your employees are facing into, or a change that your customer sees as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing which you highlighted about, what's the common mistake company make when trying to implement the VoC program. But next question, which is very important, and I received this mainly from a couple of the audience who really wants to hear your perspective on that. Many company immediately think of survey when they hear what VoC, but there are many more feedback sources today. What channel should company be listening to?
So I think you're right. Surveys are just the tip of the iceberg. They have their purpose, right? So they are useful, but to get a holistic whole picture view, you need to understand. Well, you ultimately need a culture within your organization that is hungry to understand that customer end-to-end journey, and that means tapping into a couple of different mechanisms. So to list a couple, I think you've got to fundamentally, first and foremost, look at your unprompted feedback. So what are your customers saying to you when you're not actually asking the question? So some of that, and what I mean by that is, live chat transcripts, support emails, customer service calls. Some of the most honest feedback you get from your customers is when they're just trying to get help from you. And that's those kind of transcripts that have some real richness to them. People aren't checking a box from 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. They're using their own words and their own language to tell you exactly what's frustrating them and what's broken. And ultimately, that's a gold mine if you can untap it. I think the second piece of kind of data points that is really interesting is the actions that your customers actually take. So sometimes what a customer says and what a customer does are completely different things. So you need to pay close attention to how people interact with you and your organization. So whether that be your website or your app or whatever it might be. So, are they abandoning their shopping carts? Are they clicking away from a specific page? If your survey says your checkout is easy, but half of your customers drop off at the payment screen, clearly your checkout process isn't easy. So you've got to trust those customer actions and utilize that as insight as well. The behavior ultimately kind of tells you what needs fixing. The third point I would say is probably kind of public data, so customer conversations or online conversations, and that just doesn't look at comments on Facebook or Instagram posts. It's the real kind of unfiltered opinions that are shared in places like Reddit, community forums, Trustpilot, independent review sites, that kind of thing. And that's where your biggest fans show up. But it's also where your toughest critics show up as well. And they look to talk to one another. And if you can utilize that insight and that raw verbatim as useful data to help understand what are you getting wrong, but also fundamentally, what are you getting right and should be doing more of, that can be really interesting. And then the fourth point, and I've kind of touched on it earlier, but it's your frontline teams, it's your employees, it's what do they see, what do they hear from customers daily. We emphasize this an awful lot at Core Consultancy. Too many organizations don't utilize their frontline employees as a data source when it comes to better understanding customers. But they're the ones answering the phones, talking to customers in stores, managing the accounts. They notice those little frustrations way before it shows as a pattern in any form of data. And if you don't have an easy way for your employees to pass that feedback up the chain to management, you're missing out on some of your best insight that's available. But I would fundamentally say, ultimately, it's not just about collecting more data. It's about connecting the dots together from those data sources. So when a customer, complains on a support call, you then see that same customer dropping off your website at the exact same spot. And the frontline teams, when you ask them what are the customer frustrations that they've faced, and they say, yes, people complain about, to me all the time about the kind of dropping off the website at checkout or whatever it might be, then fundamentally that's when you finally understand what ultimately needs to change in the process that will then drive customer satisfaction.
That's a good insight for audience to know. Next question is collecting feedback is one thing, but turning it into the actionable insight is another challenge. How should your company approach this?
So I think this is the biggest trap that organizations fall into, and I touched upon it a little bit earlier in the conversation around some organizations just capture data and customer feedback because they think it's the right thing to do, but they're not necessarily doing anything with it. So the important sentence here for me is data without context is just noise. It doesn't mean anything. You need to have context to that data that then allows you to do something with it. So having a spreadsheet full of customer complaints isn't insight. It's just, a pretty stressful reading, right? It doesn't necessarily, you're not going to want to read that of an evening. So to actually make it useful, you need a practical approach to translate that customer noise into actions that the business can actually take. So I kind of take a couple of approaches to this. So the first piece is you need to look for the big picture. So you can't fix everything at once. So you need to start by pulling all of your feedback and data points, surveys, support calls, reviews, and all of that needs to be in one place. And once it's in one place, it then allows you to connect the dots together to the point I was making earlier around creating insight. What you're then looking for are the common threads throughout those data points. And if you see the same issue popping up over and over again, then that's ultimately your starting point and where you should prioritize your effort. Once you've done that, you need to then take a step back and say, so what? So just noticing a trend is an observation, not necessarily an insight. An observation is saying people are complaining about slow delivery. That doesn't really help. An insight goes a little bit deeper into that. So an insight would look at it and say, well, actually, people complaining about delivery times, and it's because of the warehouse, for example, takes 48 hours to pack the items into a box. Once you've dug past the initial complaint and you've identified the root cause, that's then an insight that the business can then go away and actually look to resolve and improve the process, which then fundamentally removes the complaint and improves the customer satisfaction. The third point here is then as I said earlier, go to your team to fix it. Just because you're a manager in a boardroom doesn't mean you have the best ideas on how you should fix that process. You've probably never done the process yourself. So actually speaking to your teams and understanding where they could improve the process, or if they could make changes to the process, what would they be? Utilizing that to then help you identify the root cause is fundamentally gold dust. And then I think the final piece in terms of making data and insight and actionable, you then need to be able to put a price tag on it. So you need to be able to say, by fixing this problem for our customers and fixing this process, it will generate us X amount in revenue. And this is ultimately kind of the key to getting, leadership buy-in. And we'll come on to talk about this in a couple of questions. But you have to translate that customer frustration into cash. And it can be simple. So you can keep the maths kind of fairly simple and pragmatic. So you could, for example, you could say we get 200 calls a week about one confusing step at checkout. Each call takes a staff member 10 minutes to resolve. Once you've done that, you can then start to say that poor process is then costing us X amount of dollars or X amount of cash a week in wages to apologize to our customers for it. And when you can take that raw complaint, find the root cause, attach a solution from your team, and prove exactly by fixing it how much cash you will be able to save, that's when you start to be able to produce true insight that the business will then wake up to and actually want to resolve.
Yeah, got it. Have you seen this kind of customer in your experience? They're they had faced this problem before?
Yeah, I think so. So ultimately, I've had experience whereby a voice of customer program we've established and we've captured insight. But actually, fundamentally, the insight that's being drawn out isn't necessarily, the most interesting problem that the business wants to fix. So it's not about launching a new loyalty program or anything like that. It's actually fundamental basics of making sure you're doing right by the business and making sure you're doing right by the customer. And some organizations don't necessarily want to, they invest a lot of money in customer experience only for it to then spit out at the other end some basic hygiene factors that they should just be doing right. The reality is, if you can identify those basic problems that mean something and are actually, you're able to tangibly say this is the impact it's having on revenue or profitability or whatever it might be, that's when you can start to do that. And I've definitely had experience of that. I've gone into board meetings whereby we're talking about some of the insights that have been generated, and the board team are turning to me and saying this isn't the kind of stuff that we were expecting to come out. And ultimately, that's not my problem. The point is, this is what your customers are genuinely talking about, and therefore it should be a priority of yours as a board member, not necessarily what you think is the right thing for us to go after. If it's a true culture of customer listening, then you act upon what your customers are saying, not what you think your customers want.
Got it. So next question is more about a lot of companies collect insight but struggle to operate them. What does operationalizing VoC actually look like inside an organization?
So I think this is putting it into practice is where the culture of your organization takes center stage here. And this is where the kind of all the pieces finally slot together. So operationalizing means, in my view, listening to customers stops being a side project or one department's role, and ultimately becomes the normal way of doing business day to day across departments. So in practical terms, it means you capture the issues through your surveys, through your conversation logs, through your data points. You listen to your frontline teams, and then you actively give them a voice to the solution. You need a mix of people around the room. So you need product development, you need marketing, you need operations, you need frontline, looking at exactly the same feedback, and then thinking about how does their individual department play a role in fixing this customer problem. It shouldn't just be for customer experience teams to fix the problem, because actually the problem spans across multiple departments. What that then does is it forces teams out of their own little independent silos and bubbles. It means that the product team uses customer feedback to decide what they're going to build next, but they do it in consultation with the staff who actually speak to the customers. So there's no point in designing a product or designing an element of a product that you think is based on customer insight, but actually fundamentally doesn't work for the people that are using it to talk to your customers. It needs to be done in collaboration. And in order to do that, you need a culture of trust, and you need to cultivate that trust across your organization. You have to give your staff, real-time feedback and the actual authority to fix things for unhappy customers there and then. And above all, making it work means accountability. So when a frontline worker highlights a broken process and suggests a fix, leadership need to own that fix. They need to set a deadline. They need to prove the fix has actually worked. And then they need to be able to close that feedback loop. So from customer to employee to leadership and back again, that's how you truly embed voice of customer into your DNA. But ultimately, it's about using voice of customer data as the hopper of opportunities that the whole organization needs to fix, not just one individual department.
Got it. Good. So the next thing is we are seeing rapid adoption of AI tools. I think AI is big things nowadays that analyze customer conversation and feedback. How do you see AI transforming voice of the customer?
Yeah, so everybody's talking about AI, aren't they? Everybody. And ultimately, AI is the ultimate filter for sorting what you see as the signal, i.e., your customer data, from the noise of general feedback. So it is right; it's completely revolutionizing kind of our industry by being able to chew through mountains of messy feedback, customer verbatim data at scale that ultimately we couldn't have imagined a number of years back, right? Because we had data analysts manually trawling through those data sets to try and identify what the patterns are, whereas now you can pump it into an AI model and have those insights generated within a couple of minutes. So it's it can read millions of chat logs, emails, call transcripts in an instant, and grouping them by what the customer is trying to do and how they are feeling. And it is a huge tool in being able to lift large data sets that traditionally in customer experience was quite a slow and painful process for us to work through. However, and I think this bit is absolutely vital, AI is the tool to help us, and it's not a replacement, in my view, for kind of human thinking and human interaction. So what AI can do is it can tell you exactly where the patterns are, but it can't fix the process for you, and it can't fix the company culture. So what AI should be used for, in my view, is that it should help leadership teams identify where they should be investing their effort and their time. But ultimately, it still needs those teams and leadership teams to collectively get around the table, think about how they can improve that process, and think about how they can create the culture within the organization to be customer-centric. So it should be seen as a tool, not a golden egg that's going to fix everything. As I kind of said, it touches on, it helps you identify the trends, but you still need those frontline teams to look at the data, apply their empathy and real world context to those customers, and come up with creative ideas and the ability for those individuals to save customers when it's required. What it does, though, is it also gives you a highly accurate map of the road ahead. So you're able to view what might be coming down the line in terms of opportunities within the industry, but equally, problems that might arise further down the line that you're not necessarily experiencing at the minute. But you ultimately need your team to help determine how well you can approach those and address those in the future. So the businesses that are going to win, in my view, are the ones that use AI to help spot those problems instantly and quickly, which then frees up their teams to be able to focus on stop putting out the fires and fixing those problems as and when they come up, but proactively being able to suggest changes to process, brilliant ideas on how they can improve the business. So the businesses that I see who are going to thrive are the ones that can utilize AI as the kind of signal which then allows the business and the human interaction to then look at that signal and think, how can we prevent it from happening?
Is there any specific AI tools or something which you can suggest to our audience where they can use for this kind of activities?
Yeah, so previously I've used it's utilizing AI, but one of the tools that I've used previously is an organization called Relative Insight. And what Relative Insight do is they take raw verbatim text data and they analyze it against the language set. And what was really interesting working with those guys was that we were able to identify, as an example, we kind of uploaded our verbatim data once a kind of week, and we were able to start to be able to say, in week 3 versus week 10, our customers in week 10 were 5 times more likely to talk about delays to customer orders than they were in week 3. So what it was able to then do is allow us to identify over time where were we potentially getting things wrong, or where was a problem starting to become a bigger problem for an organization. And what that then allowed us to do as an organization was then be really specific and accurate in terms of where we put our efforts. So, Relative Insight was a brilliant tool that we utilized, previously in an organization I worked for.
That's good. So we have a last question before we jump into the question and answer from audience. So the question is like, one challenge many CX leaders face is getting executive buy-in for VoC program. What advice would you give them?
So I think here, this is ultimately one of the biggest problems that I think organizations face, because they know that this is the right thing to do in terms of voice of customer programs, but actually being able to connect it to pounds and pence and cash or revenue improvement or profitability improvement is sometimes the disconnect. So getting leadership buy-in for this kind of stuff for me isn't just about asking for additional budget or a new software platform. It's about getting the permission, right from the top, to actually change the company culture to be more customer centric. And to do that, you've ultimately got to speak the language of the boardroom. So you've got to talk in the realms of growing revenue, cutting costs, and reducing risks or improving profitability. And what directors do is they definitely care about customer happiness and customer satisfaction, but only if you can prove it and how it impacts the bottom line. And that's the way you can get individuals enticed into these kind of voice of customer programs. So if you pitch listening to your customers purely as an exercise that's a nice to do and it makes people smile, you're going to lose their attention in 5 minutes. So my advice would be you build a rock solid commercial business case, where you show directors exactly how much one specific customer frustration or one specific customer headache is costing the business right now. Whether that's in longer support calls, refunds, or lost sales. Pick out one specific example that you've got that is causing your customer frustrations, that is driving a tangible cash impact. And then you want to show them the kind of formulas that we've talked about previously. So you want to be able to tell them, by investing in a proper voice of customer program, you'll utilize that structured data, you'll utilize AI platforms to find those exact frustrations. And then from those exact frustrations, you'll be able to identify the true cost of what that frustration is having for you and your organization. You'll then utilize the kind of untapped potential of your frontline teams to help identify opportunities of how you could fix that frustration. And when leadership teams then see you combining, customer data with employee empowerment and how that then directly drives operational efficiency and profitability, that they won't just give you a budget, they'll champion ultimately the program right from the top down through the rest of the organization.
Good. So it's a great insights of the subject. I think many of us get to know more about what's a VoC program, or how important for company to do implementation of that things. And hopefully we or our audience can might be implement these for their day-to-day activities. So if anyone have any question, feel free to ask. So we have some question from the audience. One question is about the fundamental question. Like the question is, how do you define clear objective before launching a VoC initiative?
So was that, how do you define clear objectives?
Clear objectives before launching the VoC initiatives.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally everybody knows that listening to customers is the right thing to do, right? It goes to the point I was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of leadership buy-in, and therefore you need to be able to connect. You know, why does a business do something? A business does something to drive the bottom line further forward, whether that be to increase profitability, drive revenue. So from an objective perspective, when you talk about setting up a voice of customer program, you need to be really clear to say, what are the metrics that we expect to see move forward as a result of operating this program forward in the business? And that could be a couple of things. So that could be customer satisfaction. We expect to move forward by X points, X percentage over a 12-month period. That's great. People can then start to say, well, actually, our customer satisfaction's moved forward. But in reality, what does that actually mean? How has that generated additional revenue for us? How has it generated additional value for us? You can start to really talk about and say, well, actually, we anticipate by increasing customer satisfaction, the lifetime value of that customer is going to increase by 10%. Therefore, we anticipate that within the first 12 months, our revenue is going to increase by X amount. So if you can start to draw the connection, and I've definitely faced into some of these conversations, right, around what is the true objective of setting up this program? Well, fundamentally, it's to better understand where we're getting things wrong for our customers. It's to better improve our customer satisfaction, which in turn will drive lifetime value, loyalty, which by getting those things right, then start to drive revenue and drive profitability. So I think you can simply kind of articulate it. The key bit is being able to articulate it in a way that actually means something to the people that hold the purse strings and will release the budget in order for you to go and set up that voice of customer program. But if you think about it as an enabler for increased profitability, increased revenue through, customer loyalty is a huge metric in this space. Customer lifetime value is a huge metric in this place. If you get something right for a customer, they're far more likely to come back and purchase from you again. If you get something wrong, ultimately, they're far less likely to do that, and therefore that's the opportunity in terms of where there's the additional metrics to be gone after.
Perfect. One question from Adam. It's all related to data collection and channel. So the question is, how do you balance qualitative versus quantitative feedback?
It's a really good question. So qualitative, I think is it has both of them have their place, right? So qualitative feedback enables you to measure specifically on a dashboard view for somebody that understands numbers, how that feedback is, helping us move forward. So if you are truly wanting to understand, customer satisfaction, period, quarter, you can start to harness that, and it definitely has its place. By being able to identify and measure those metrics, it's a period, you can then start to pull out and say, okay, well, what are we getting right for our customers through that qualitative data? If you then start to see in the quantitative data that your satisfaction is tracking downwards, it's then an indicator for you to start to dig into your qual data a little bit more to understand what is it specifically that we're getting wrong. So I don't think it's a case of, one is better than the other. The true organizations, though, that really embed a true voice of customer programs are the ones that harness the qualitative data properly in a way that enables them to better understand why some of the quant data moves are happening. So if customer satisfaction is going up, great, but what is it within that qual data that's telling us why that's happening? Similarly, vice versa, if it's declining, what is it that's happening within that space? So ultimately, I think you need both of them in order to have a true voice of customer program that's effective.
One more question is from Marin Malgard. The question is, how easy is to get employee to provide feedback?
Very good question. So it's easy if you have the right culture. So if you don't have the right culture of effective listening, the feeling that employees can surface ideas without, fear of somebody coming back to them and saying, terrible idea, why on earth have you kind of, suggested it? It's really easy. If you don't have that culture and you have a kind of blame culture within your organization, employees are going to be far less likely to want to actually generate ideas and surface them up. In my experience, though, the organizations that have the true voice of customer programs that are really successful are the ones that have established that culture that trusts and encourages employees to surface up ideas. There's a ton of stuff out there in terms of ideation, and I've worked with organizations in the past that focus and specialize on employee ideation and mechanisms and tools to be able to capture those ideas. There's also, opportunities to gamify it. So how do you get to a place where you're almost rewarding employees for suggesting ideas if it has a direct impact and fixes a customer pain point? If you can start to do that, and Rahul generates an idea and it's a great idea that then fixes the customer pain point and gets rewarded as a result of suggesting that idea, all of a sudden Rahul's kind of colleagues around him will then start to say, well, hang on, Rahul's been rewarded for suggesting an idea. I'm now more likely to actually want to start suggesting ideas on how to fix a specific pain point. But it comes back to fundamentally the trust that you have within your organization and how empowered your employees feel. People come to work because they ultimately want to be part of something. They need to be paid. Ultimately, that's why people come to work, right? But if you can start to make sure that individuals feel like they have a say within the organization and have impact and autonomy within the organization, that's where you can create a really high performance work culture that ultimately will resonate down into your customer experience scores.
Great. So audience, we have just 5 minutes. If anybody wants to talk, I can just make you talk directly to Mike for your question. Just raise your hand. We just have 5 minutes and we have to quickly cover 1 or 2 questions. So one more question is like, how can business ensure that they are capturing honest and unbiased feedback?
I think you're always going to get unbiased or biased feedback coming through. The secret here is collecting enough of it that actually means that you've got the biased feedback is outweighed by the unbiased feedback coming through. But you are absolutely always going to get those kind of customers that have had an okay experience but are really loud in the way in which they complain about it. Successful organizations are the ones that are able to identify, okay, well, Mike's complained very heavily, said there was a serious incident that happened. They're the organizations that then dig into the detail and understand actually what has gone right, what has gone wrong, and then be able to identify that actually the customers, maybe over-egging their actual feedback or is under-egging it a little bit. But it comes down to me for the piece of collect enough of it, and actually what you will get is the majority of feedback that comes through is going to be unbiased, but there will inevitably always be those kind of individual pieces that do come through that are biased. The key bit here, though, to the point earlier, is if you can correlate all of those data points into one place and spot those patterns, the reality is that that biased feedback probably isn't going to join all the way through all of those different data points and those patterns. And actually, as you start to collate it together, you identify the true voice of customer, not necessarily just the loudest voice in the room.
Perfect. Mike, you gave a lot of suggestions, feedback, and so many things to audience. I think they will utilize your the insights which we discussed in last 30 minutes. Can you just give a key takeaway for which audience has to really needs to take that things into the consideration specifically for VoC program? As in closing notes.
Yeah, by all means. So I think fundamentally, first and foremost, is when you're setting up a voice of customer program, do it for the right reasons. Don't do it for the sake of doing it. Do it for the reason of truly wanting to understand what your customers are saying, and do it with the view and the kind of commitment that you're actually going to act upon the outputs of it. And you're going to do something to change the operation. You're going to do something to change the process, which will have an impact on your customers. If you ask for, more negatively impactful than it would be to not ask them at all. So that'd be first and foremost. Secondly, is make sure that you are identifying those patterns across multiple different data sources. Don't just rely upon one data source to steer your decision. Just because you have one specific incident that happens, don't make decisions to processes based on one instance. Make sure that you map that across multiple different data sources and are able to validate that it is a true issue before you start to put effort into actually fixing it. And then the third point, and you've probably heard me talk about this an awful lot, but ultimately make sure that you've got the culture of customer centricity established within your organization before you try to implement a program. If you try to implement a program and your board isn't really interested in customer satisfaction and the benefits that a voice of customer program brings, you're going to be hit. You're going to have some issues as you face into that voice of customer program. If you can identify the culture and ensure that your board has the true understanding of the reason as to why you're generating this voice of customer program, what it is that you want to go after, and the true benefits that it can provide, you'll have a far more easier ride than you will do than if you face into a program, set something up, and then all of a sudden identify that your organization isn't customer centric. And then the fourth point I would touch on is utilize the voice of customer, the voice of your employees. It's not utilized enough. Voice of customer programs should be known as voice of customer and employee programs, because ultimately your employees can ensure that you are fixing the problems that your customers are facing day in, day out. And ultimately, sometimes your employees might also be customers as well. So therefore, they've got a vested interest to try and improve that as well. So they'd be my four in terms of top picks of what I would suggest you focus on if you're looking to establish a voice of customer program, or you have one and you're looking to develop it further.
Great. So thank you, Mike, for your great insights on overall subject. So as in Verbix, we keep organizing such kind of webinars specifically for CX, customer center, customer experience people to know more about like what's going on in the market and all. So if you are interested for such webinar to have you to be part of it, feel free to email us or reach out to us and we'll consider you as a speaker for our next webinar. Thank you again, Mike, for your great insight. Everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. Thank you so much.